Today, Ryan and I are going to give you a preview of Nippon Zaibatsu. This is a new edition of Nippon. Nippon's a game we played years ago.
Yeah.
There was an expansion I don't think either of us had played.
No.
This does some things differently. It might incorporate some of the things from the expansion. We're not so sure, but we're going to tell you today a little bit about the game, but also more importantly, what's new about this edition.
Yeah, so if you've never heard of Nippon, we will talk about that a little bit. If all you're interested in is knowing what's different, then maybe you can skip this little bit of a part. But the focus in this game, Nippon, it's called Zaibatsu because this was a big kind of practice in Japan, almost like creating these conglomerations. Zaibatsu is all of these different factories and businesses that were kind of owned by the same family. And that is what you're doing in the game. You are effectively opening factories, creating goods, and then delivering these goods out to the board. So the first thing you're going to notice if you're looking at this game right now is a vastly different presentation.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's the number one new thing I think that's going to be very apparent when you see this. This is a deluxe version of a game.
For
We've
sure.
got nice little bits here. Everything is wooden that we're going to be placing on our player boards out on the board.
Well, and the player boards themselves.
The player boards are huge, and the graphic design and everything is really, really top notch.
Yeah, and it's everything. They're dual layered and they're great. But the whole point of the game, the whole goal is to come out here into Japan and deliver goods. And you're producing these goods. There's like a multi-step process here where you're building a factory by taking a factory and placing it on your player board. Then you're taking these little machines off your player board, adding them to that factory, and then you're running that factory to produce goods, and then you're delivering those goods out onto the board and using these little supply tokens to place out there to denote that you've delivered goods. And then there's a little area control mechanic where you're scoring in these areas based on how well you've delivered. I mean, that is the game in a nutshell, but all of that, everything you're doing is powered by what is still, years later, I think, a very innovative and unique, it's almost like worker placement. It's almost like a reverse worker placement game, almost.
It is. It's also kind of like a worker placement meets action selection because there's workers out in these banks out here. And this is like the original game too. On your turn, you're either going to be taking a worker, placing it on your board, taking an action, or you're consolidating, which we'll get to in a second. But you're going to take a worker of one of these colors above these actions. And you can see there's two actions below many of these, one action here. You're going to take that worker and put it in the bottommost spot of this track and then take whatever that action is. Again, these actions range from building factories, building trains, doing all the different things Ryan was just sort of overviewing. But there is some strategy for how you're doing this based on the color of work you're taking, how long you want to wait until you consolidate, things like that.
Yeah, and they have changed that. So we'll talk about that in a little bit because that is one of the major changes as well as some of the things you're actually doing on the board. But yeah, like David said, the whole idea is to take these actions, get your things out there. You're either building those factories like I talked about and running those factories. Some of these actions are going to just move up your tracks. You have an R&D track that determines how nice of factories you can make. You have a raw materials or mining track that determines how much coal you get. And then you have a finance track that determines how much money you can get. And you're going to be moving these all up by taking these actions. There's one more action, and this is still from the basic game. You have these contracts that you start with, and everybody starts with the same 8 contracts that you'll be able to fulfill. And that's one way to kind of get your finances. Now, trains go out on the board just like they did before. Everything you're kind of doing is to control these areas. And as the rounds go, every time you pass one of these markers here, you're doing like a little area control scoring for each one of these areas. You're looking at who has delivered what goods. And this is a whole core part of the game, is this track right here. And as you're delivering these goods, you go through that process of manufacturing them and then delivering them. Based on how many you deliver, if you deliver 1, 2, or 3, it's going to give you up to like 3, 5, or 7 power of a marker to place out based on what good. If I deliver a maximum of 3 light bulbs, for example, I get to put that 7, and now that's added up, and I have a quite significant amount of power out there in that region, which is supplemented by your trains. And you're really trying to fight for those points.
Yeah, you are trying to fight for those points. There's some things in this game that you're not fighting for like you did in the original game, though.
Yeah.
Some of the things that you're going to be doing in this game that are different. Are we ready for the differences?
Yeah, let's talk about the differences.
One of the big differences that you're going to, when you're reading the rules or hearing the rules, you're going to notice the shipping is done very, very differently. In the original game, the ships were right over here in these areas with the trains. In this one, we've got the Irakura mission, which is thematically representative of people from Japan going to all different far reaches of the world, bringing back experts in different categories. So instead of placing ships out here, you're going to place ships in these tracks, getting these sort of somewhat temporary workers, the workers that fill up one of your worker space that represents an expert, and getting some bonus tiles as well that kind of modify some of the things you can get during that second part of the game.
Yeah, and this is a huge, huge change. So you have all of these different departments, and each department is going to give you something based on the color of your worker. Now, if you've played Nippon before, you know that when you're drafting, you are trying to draft specific colors of workers. What you really wanted to do in the base game was draft all of the same color if you could. Now, that's going to be really hard because certain actions, people are going to take workers, whatever, and if they notice you're taking all the blues, they're going to start taking blues. But you want to take as many of the same workers as possible. And it didn't matter which color you took, because at the end of your consolidation phase, after you go through all your consolidation, you're paying, you get some income, and then you have to pay $3 or 3 yen for every color of worker you have. So if you did manage to take all the same, then you only pay $3. But if you paid all different, you're paying like, 12 or whatever. Like, it gets very expensive. But in this new version of the game, they have this department track. And when you consolidate, it's looking at the first worker you drafted, and if you get high enough, also the topmost worker you drafted. So if I would draft like these 3 guys here and say, for example, I draft another yellow. When you consolidate, you look at your first worker and your last worker, and you're going to get their department bonus. So in addition to the income I would get, the coal and the finances that I would get, I would take the blue worker and get 3 more yen, and take the yellow worker and get 2 more victory points.
And you can
That's
modify
huge.
that track.
Yeah.
Back at the shipping, one of the things you can get are tiles that will let you modify the various spaces. Now, when you take a tile, it's going to modify a very specific space, just making it a little sweeter, but allowing you to sort of build not really an engine, but a little bit more of something you're looking to do depending on the workers that you're taking.
Well, yeah, it's another way to get stuff, because Nippon is notoriously tight. And with the addition, we didn't talk about this, but they actually introduced even a new resource, which is steel, that you'll have to collect to do some of the buildings like trains and ships, and even putting some of the machines in your factories that used to not only cost money, now also cost steel. So they've given you more to get, so you have to kind of work harder to get the resources, but yet they've given you this way of getting them if you can plan it right, if you can take the right color worker. So that first worker you take now becomes very important. It's not so much just grab whatever on the action you want to take, because maybe you don't really need that bonus. You want to take a worker that when you consolidate, so you're thinking like, I'm going to consolidate in like 5 turns or 6 turns or whatever. That's when you're finally going to get that reward. So it does really benefit you from paying off, and it benefits you from getting shipping early, because not only are you getting that department bonus upgrade so that it's better for the rest of the game, you're also getting these temporary workers. And the reason these matter is because of something that they've changed as well. So I'll talk about this a little bit. Again, when you consolidated in Nippon, there's this whole scoring mechanic of the game. And there was this little like table out there. And if you consolidated with 1 worker on your player board, 2, 3, whatever, you would come to this little pool. Everyone was competing for it.
Yes.
And you would take a scoring modifier and then put it on your player board. So you would be saying, I'm going to score my ships. I decide I want to score my ships. How many ships I have out is going to be multiplied by that multiplier. And it was like ×1. And then you could eventually get to ×3. But the problem was, or at least the thing that people complained about, whether or not it's a problem is up to you.
Yes.
But what people complained about was that was a race. And if you had players that were playing really efficiently, or maybe even like just better, I guess.
You can grab some of those higher modifiers.
Right.
And they wouldn't be there for other players. Now in this one, the modifiers are more under the player's control for themselves. So you won't be locked out in that sort of race. But that's not to say that this game still isn't tight.
Oh, it still is.
And cutthroat in many ways. But you're going to be able to get those modifiers. So any one player could get up to 3 of the top modifier and place it on any one of those scoring mechanisms at the end.
Yeah, and that scoring still works in a similar way. You would take one of those. So if I take my biggest flower, if I was to consolidate and I had all my spaces full and I consolidate, you get to place that and you choose what you score. But it's not just like a flat modifier anymore. If you remember the original game, it was like contracts were like 1 point for every 2 times your modifier, and like trains were like 1 point for every train time, whatever. All that's gone. You can actually look directly at your player board, and you'll see for the top half of the player board, there are these colored lines. If you get your markers past those lines, or if you get like all of your ships out or trains out or whatever past those lines, it just tells you that you're either going to get 10, 16, or 20 points. There's no more math. There's no more multipliers involved. If I placed my biggest flower there and I cleared it, I'm just going to get 20 points for that row.
Yeah.
It streamlines it. I don't want to say that it makes it simpler because
No,
it's
I
still
don't think so.
doing the math of these, because if you do this early, you might consolidate. Your first consolidation, you might want to wait until you have 6 guys. You're putting this thing out and basically committing to saying, yeah, I'm going to get this all the way to the end. But then halfway through the game, you might not have moved it at all and go, shoot, I really need to start focusing on that because I decided early in the game. So some people might, start with the small ones and say, okay, I'm okay getting less points. But then if it ends up that that's the one that you moved all the way to the end, you're locked in. You're only getting the smallest possible value. So it does, I think, really change the way that you think about in-game scoring.
Yeah, and speaking of the consolidation too, I think that whole track over here, depending on the color of worker, injects a little bit of an interesting aspect that the original game didn't have as much. Whereas you're going to consider like the last worker you placed potentially having some impact and maybe consolidating sooner than you might have in the original game, instead of just waiting. Because most people, I think, generally were waiting as long as they could to consolidate, depending on whether or not they were racing to get some of the stuff on the board.
Yeah, you really wanted to consolidate with 6 as soon as possible, because if you got locked out of those ×3s, it made it almost impossible to win. Now you don't have that problem. And again, just like in the base game, you are still paying for colored. So if I was in this situation where I have like 3 different colors and I'm paying $9, you still want to maybe consolidate just with one, a few guys so that you're paying less money. Because if you're in a situation where you've got all the blues and there's no blues out and you really don't want to add another color, you might want to consolidate and you still can potentially get the smaller modifier. You're not really necessarily worried about what other players are doing when that comes into play, but the game is still just as cutthroat. And the whole delivering goods process is just as mean and as blocking, and as, you're watching other players, and if they're going to an area, you want to go to that area. All of that is still there.
Yeah, and speaking of delivering goods, if you remember the original game, this one still has that aspect. I don't know if you mentioned this earlier. When you're delivering those goods, there's some of those tokens you only have one of.
Right.
Once you do that simple little one delivery, that's the last token you have for certain goods. So then you kind of have to get better and better. You can't just spend the rest of the game making little deliveries.
Right.
You have to really ramp up.
When you get the level 1 factory that produces cotton, and you only have the one. Now, somebody else might come, I'm going to take yours for an example, and they might bump you out with like a slightly better paper delivery, and then you get your one back, and now I can come back and deliver a one.
Yeah.
But again, coming to these different areas and being able to support them with your trains, because trains give you some area control too, this is where a significant amount of the scoring is going to happen. And they've actually modified the numbers. They've done some balance to the scoring. First of all, it's not just the top 3 that score. Everybody that's involved in that area will get some points. You'll notice it drops off significantly when you get to the bottom. It goes from like 8 to 2, and at the end of the game, you get 4. But that still gives you a reason to maybe drop in somewhere where you wouldn't have done otherwise just to get those 4 points. So that's kind of neat as well.
Yeah, one more thing, and we totally glossed over this because it's the first new thing we should have mentioned. At the beginning of the game, players are going to draft these new tiles that give you basically your starting resources, some starting powers that you're going to initially take to really kind of kickstart the game, which didn't even exist in the original game.
These starting tiles, you're kind of mixing one that's an action. It's going to give you something to do at the beginning of the game to kind of get you started.
Some starting points.
And it's going to determine your starting victory points. So some of the tiles that are more powerful give you less victory points. And then you've got these arrangements that are all random of your starting resources. So the game does, like I said, it gives you so much you need to do, and it gives you even a new resource that you have to manage. So if you're asking yourself, man, that game is already tight, how do we manage a whole nother resource? And this is a valuable resource. You use it, some of the contracts now require it. Some of the trains and ships require it. Some of the factories require it. So it's difficult to balance.
Yeah,
so that does really help.
There's a little bit more of a balancing act, but also at the same time, I think having that extra resource also, in a way, injects a little bit of flexibility with what you're building. For instance, when you build the train, you can spend money and 1 steel, or you can spend just a bunch of steel.
And I would say, like, people, the first comment I hear people saying is like, oh, but I like how tight Nippon is. Okay. That's fair. But there are gamers like myself, and like I would speak for you as well.
100%.
I like having all these bonuses fire off, and I like having way more ways to like get things. And I like leaning into those combos of like, you feel really smart when you plan out your Zaibatsu and you get your workers here and you're consolidating, you're getting exactly what you need. It's a really good feeling. And there's one more change that leans into that. that, and this is what David hinted at earlier, because I never played the expansion to Nippon, but I know that the expansion introduced some new factories. This game starts with a ton of different factories, and these factories aren't just producing goods. Every factory that you take into your Zaibatsu is going to give you some kind of power. It's going to give you an immediate effect. It's going to give you potentially in-game scoring. Ongoing effects when you take specific actions. Like, there are a lot of different powers, and there's a whole player aid that's going to break down like what all of the different factories give you. And this is a significant way to capitalize on these factories by getting like 4 coal exactly when you're about to run out of coal. But what it does is it causes you to kind of look at these factories and think more about the power, but you have to balance that with what factor do you actually need, because it's like, well, I really want to build clocks, but I can't pass up on this light bulb ability. And they've taken away the restriction of factories. You can build as many different factories of different kinds as you want. So if you really did, you could just focus on building a bunch of paper factories just to get those bonuses, even though they are the lowest level possible factory. So I just think with all of this new stuff layered in, it gives you so much more to think about on top of what you were already thinking about in Nippon.
Yeah, it really is a great looking game. All the production, these little booklets here for the player aids on the back of it, it has the whole turn structure and everything, not to mention it, like Ryan said, all of those factories sort of detailed, which is nice to have for every player in their hand. And the pieces are amazing. I have to say, we did recently a best player board.
This is a nice player board.
This is a nice player board. Everything looks really good on this.
Yeah.
But that is Nippon Zaibatsu. If you have any questions at all about it, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.